Episode 18. Yes, guys, welcome to the 18th episode of the Connect the Dots podcast. As you can probably tell by the title, we went in a slightly different direction with this one. On this episode, I sat down with an expert in the senior housing industry and discussed the senior housing crisis. So, without further ado, thank you for joining me today, and let's get started. Meredith Oppenheim has spent nearly 25 years in the senior housing industry, working with leading owners and advocating for improvements, including authoring a white paper for the American Senior Housing Association, which influenced how the industry serves the next generation of older adults. She founded Vitality Society, a virtual senior community featured in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Forbes, ABC, Fox, and NBC, recognized for its positive impact on people aged 60 and better. In high school, Meredith earned the U.S. Congressional Award for her service to seniors and served on Mayor Bloomberg's Age Friendly Commission and the New York City Department of Aging. A frequent speaker, she has presented at SXSW and Harvard Business School, where she graduated and contributed to a senior housing case. Thank you so much for joining me today, Meredith.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here. And let us enjoy and have fun in this conversation on a topic that means so much to me. And I salute the great work you're doing to recognize entrepreneurs that are trying to create new ways of improving and having an impact on so many different parts of society.
Thank you so much for your kind words. I want to start with your origin story. How did you get into this? And so you spent nearly 25 years working in senior housing. What first drew you to this field, especially so early in your career?
Well, it's very interesting. It starts when I was closer in age to you. I was 15 years old, and my girlfriends from high school decided after school they were going to go candy stripe, which was essentially being good, cheerful volunteers in the hospital. And I decided early on that I didn't really want to be in a hospital or around sick people. So I decided that I was going to go home and I was going to with ingredients that were healthy, create different recipes that I thought my grandparents who came every weekend would enjoy because their longevity and vitality became my priority. I loved being with them. I loved that they spent the weekends with us. And I'm from Central Jersey and they were living in Queens. And I was so happy that they came. And so I decided that I was going to bake these samples, prepare them, show step by step how easy it was, and go to the senior centers to share this information. And so that began my commitment to an older population that is too often overlooked. And I loved doing this work. Truthfully, I went with my grandfather. I didn't drive at the time, so my parents had to take me. It was a whole family, 3-generation affair, and we all had the best time. And the seniors that were there thoroughly enjoyed hearing my grandpa. He would warm up the crowd, make all these great jokes, and then I would bake for them step by step and pass out these samples. And it became a labor of love. And I ultimately wrote a cookbook that had all the recipes showing how simple it was to eat better, to live longer, which was a novelty at the time, right? The generation I was serving was from the Great Depression. They were happy to just have food on the table. Things are much more sophisticated. People are much more educated now, but at the time it was pretty novel that what you eat would be correlated to the type of life you would lead. And so I began that work as a teenager. And after graduating Harvard Business School in 2001, I had a wonderful conversation with a professor who was also a Cornell trustee, which is where I went to undergrad. And I said to her, she's the founder of Staples. I said, what am I going to do? I'm about to graduate. And she said, what do you care about? And I said, I always cared about seniors. I loved doing this work in high school. And she said, then go work with seniors. And I thought to myself, what am I going to do? So, like a good MBA, I wrote a chart and I thought about all the touch points with seniors, the medicine that they take, the clothes that they wear, the types of environments they live in, types of relationships that they have with families, various practitioners and providers that they needed to live well and stay well. And I thought to myself, how am I going to pick one? She said, but you have to, and you have to spend 20 years learning it and the next 20 years improving it. And that was my playbook. So I looked at the chart. I said, you know what? I'm going to go into housing. I liked it because it is, if you think of a Venn diagram, it's the combination of hospitality, healthcare, and real estate. And each one of those industries in and of itself is very complicated. But to do all of them together 24/7, focused on what I cared about, the older people, was truly what I thought the best fit. And lo and behold, it was. So I spent 25 years working for some of the largest owners and operators in the industry. I had the opportunity, like she said, to really learn and train at different companies across the full continuum of all different types of senior housing, which I'm sure we'll get into, all different phases of a project, from pre development all the way to disposition of selling a portfolio of a property. And I loved it. But as the playbook was, by the time I hit that kind of quarter century mark, I knew that in order for me to have the greatest impact, I needed to make the change happen that I wanted to see. And I know we'll talk about that as well, but ultimately, in the last few years, that's what I've been doing. So it's truly been an honor to parlay my passion into a profession. And I feel very fortunate that I've always found it very fulfilling, always interesting, and increasingly challenging. And that's enough to make a career and a life of it.
And was there a defining moment when you realized that senior housing needed a different approach, one focused on vitality rather than decline?
Such a great question. The aha moment for me was when my father got very ill a number of years ago, about 8 years ago now. And I saw his health decline. And I went with him to the various cancer centers, infusion centers, and I saw really sick people. The type of people, frankly, that I was trying to avoid in high school, right? Those that were not well. And it occurred to me that in senior housing, what a gift to be able to live in an environment where you can participate in activities, you can enjoy nice cooked meals, you could be with other people. And it is not something everybody gets to enjoy and appreciate if you get sick. And then I thought about to my mom as his caregiver. She said to me, she's like, if anything happens to daddy, I'm never moving into senior housing. And I thought to myself, my mother has such an aversion to, frankly, something she knows very little about, but has these misconceptions of what it is. And she said, no, they're not real misconceptions. It's not for me. I don't want to be around sick old people. And so I thought to myself, aha, this is the defining moment because it's not even good enough for my own mom. And frankly, often there's research that's done. A lot of people who work in the industry never move into the communities that we offer. So I thought to myself, I have to create something that's aspirational, inspirational, desirable for this next generation because just like the baby boomers did in every other phase of their life, they're going to need, want, and demand something different. And I wanted to be part of that transformation. And so that was my aha moment that my dad was not well, may never make it there. And what a treat to have so many people who enjoy so much time there that sadly I didn't think he was going to benefit from. And then my mom threatening me she was never going. I knew I had to do something differently and I couldn't waste any more time thinking about it. I had to do it.
So then let's dive into the industry of senior housing and its evolution. And so, from your vantage point, how has senior housing changed over the last 2 decades? And where do you see the biggest gaps that still need to be addressed?
Well, what's so fascinating is when I began working in the industry, my first job out of business school was at Marriott Senior Living. And my boss sent me traveling across the country. We had hundreds of communities, and he wanted me to see various different types in various different markets. And it was really thrilling. And I came back and I had this realization at the time was like, wait a second, nobody really wants what we have. They kind of go as late as possible. They often go under duress. It's not a place they want to be. Often it's a place they have to be. It occurred to me back then that I'm working in an industry that will always have a low penetration rate because it's not what people necessarily want. And so, what has changed in the industry? What's interesting is, frankly, not that much. So over the 25 years that I've been in this business, penetration has always been around 11%. We serve about 11% of seniors, which is remarkable when you think about it for an industry that's been around for over 30 years. But what's more remarkable is while the will continue to grow now that we have the baby boomers coming, so more older people, the challenges that we face haven't gone away, to your point and your question. So, number one, affordability is a huge problem. I was telling you I'd share this data point. Only 13% of single households 75 and older in the US can afford assisted living or care at home. It is staggering how unaffordable we are as an industry and how unaffordable care is for even people who reside at home. And so the affordability piece plays a huge role in this. And frankly, over time, by and large, our communities only get more expensive. So I'll give you an example of that. When I worked for a REIT by the name of Ventas, I had about 55 communities in New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, and Pennsylvania, all in what they call MSAs, major markets, primary markets. And what was fascinating was on the Upper West Side, close to where you and I live, the highest price for a one-bedroom unit with multiple meals a day and activities and transportation was like $12,000. This was roughly around the time my daughter was born. So in 2010, 12 period. Now that same unit is $25,000. So the price is more than doubled. But I don't think people are that much wealthier. Well, I know for a fact they're not, right? So we continue to have to charge more because of labor being very costly, supplies being very costly. And now with new construction has really slowed because the cost of construction has gone up as well. So these projects are very expensive to run. They're extremely and awfully cost prohibitive to build. And as a result, the supply and demand equilibrium is such that they can charge quite a bit because there's not that much inventory and there's a large population of coming. So the industry hasn't really evolved enough as it relates to the products and services we offer. And that's part of what I am so excited about this chapter of my career. In February 2025, I joined one of the largest nonprofits. So in the industry of senior housing, we have nonprofits and for-profits, and they own and operate their real estate, some variation and derivation of that. So I joined Spring Point Senior Living. I've come full circle. They're headquartered in my home county in New Jersey, and they have 19 affordable senior housing communities, people who qualified based on their income level, which is quite low. And they call this population dual eligible, which is Medicare, Medicaid. So they're old and don't have substantial funds. And then this nonprofit also has 8 campuses called Life Plan communities that have various different levels of care, which is more market rate, right? And they have 2 additional businesses for people who choose the majority of the market to stay at home and be cared for at home. So I'm loving this chapter of my career because it is the nonprofits that have the right equilibrium between mission and margin that are often the most innovative because the only stakeholders they have to satisfy are their residents, not their shareholders, not Wall Street, not the public markets. So it allows us to be able to do some of our best work and allocate resources best in innovative ways. And I have loved this chapter. It's probably my favorite of my career.
And you mentioned a statistic of the price of housing, around the Upper West Side, almost doubling from 12,000 to 25,000. And you'd shared a statistic previously with me that the 65 and over population will more than double and the 85 and over population will more than triple by 2050. And so not only are prices doubling, but also the population with which we have to deal with is doubling and even tripling with 85 and older. And so what do you think is missing from taking the work that, for example, the nonprofit is doing and making that more prevalent among our community and really trying to solve the senior housing problem?
It is a great question. So just to piggyback on the data. So the median cost for assisted living today stands at $5,300 a month, which represents a 50% increase over the past decade. Quite remarkable, right? So what is the impasse? New supply growth in the industry is going up like 2 to 3%, which is quite remarkable based on the statistics you just shared, how fast the population is growing. And the reason the new construction has dramatically slowed, almost to zero, frankly, is because the cost of building is so prohibitively expensive. So my CEO that I work for had me look at a project on the East Coast, and in order for that deal to generate the needed returns for the developer that was bringing us in, coverage and of the debt that we were going to, or the bonds that we were going to take on, and the type of margin we needed to run our business successfully, it would almost be like 2 times what the market was currently charging. And so you sit there and you say, wait a second, we're going to invest all of these years, all of these dollars, and how many people could really afford this? Are we going to be successful? So what the industry is doing more so than ever, I think, is saying, okay, could we add on? So, into a building, could we add on a new wing? Could we add a new building on the property? What can we do? Could we add little houses if there's enough land that we could buy or that we have residual land on a property? So what can we leverage in terms of the infrastructure that we have already built and that we already have? So if you think of a building like a star, right, like this, and you add another wing, right? So you're compromising, let's just say, maybe some of the green space between the wings, right? But on the other hand, you could leverage the core of that community. It may have the dining facility, the full, the kitchen, which is commercial grade, right? Building those in additional building is quite expensive. Leveraging what is there across more units reduces our per unit cost of what our fixed costs are, right? And so that's something that I think is happening. The other piece of this is, and this is something I'm so excited about, is there's no question about it. There's a huge need, what they call the forgotten middle. I don't think they're forgotten. It's just we can't serve them because we can't figure out how to do it economically speaking. So one of the initiatives I'll be working on at the end of this year, the beginning of next year, 2026, is how do we leverage the success that we've had in affordable housing, looking at the capital stack. Part of the capital stack, no question about it, has been HUD financing, which is government financing, which is harder to come by, takes longer to get, it's very competitive, doesn't occur and happen as quickly as you need it and as often as you want it. So what is a bridge to lower cost financing? Are there capital sources that we can tap into that are more philanthropic, such as family offices, foundations? You understand. So the idea is like, could we create a vehicle that we could bring in other sources of capital that can serve as a bridge to lower costs of capital ultimately? And that's something I'm really excited about. We've got to think about new ways to financially engineer these projects so that we can serve the forgotten middle and do more affordable housing in a similar way. So that's something that I'm really excited about, thinking about it as impact funds that we can generate and secure to do more projects. And that's something that, aligned with a nonprofit who has a track record serving every income level, I feel very comfortable and confident that if it's going to happen, an organization like ours and a steward like the CEO I work for and an advocate and a change agent like me will get done.
And obviously, with your experience and knowledge, you've worked across almost every stage of the real estate life cycle from pre-development to disposition. And so, what are the biggest misconceptions developers have about senior housing?
This is great. So I just posted about this in my LinkedIn yesterday, the 8th of November. So Blackstone, as you know, one of the most successful real estate um, finance entities and owners, they have dominated and been successful across many different asset classes, even operating asset classes like hotels. So they really understand this business. But the misconception, I believe, is the complexity of the healthcare, hospitality, and real estate all working together 24/7, right? In a hotel, an average length of stay might be 2 nights. Our average length of stay is 2 years. And our guests, our residents, never leave within that time, right? They're generally with us 24/7. And so our margin for error is basically zero. So one of the misconceptions is to oversimplify the complexity of those dynamics and mechanics because they're tough. The second piece, I think, is the time horizon. So if you're in the private equity business, you have like 5 to 7 years to make the returns that you're underwriting and showing your investors to raise money. Well, in our business, things happen much more slowly than ever we would need or want. And as an example of that is an individual may come to our community, have some need, pretty much no desire, and it could take 6 months for them to move in. So if you think about it, if you're dealing with a community that is struggling to fill and you have, let's just say, 25 units that are open, every 6 months, you're getting one person. Now, yes, you have a lot of people that are starting at the same time. So the sales team is working many people. But, on average, you may get at the most, I've seen very successful salespeople, maybe like 4 move-ins is good. But then you have a backdoor issue. People are passing away or need more care than the community provides. So your move-ins might be four, but your move-outs might be four as well. And so your net gain is zero. So you have two dynamics that you have to manage. You have to manage selling and getting more people in faster, and you have to do care well and hopefully reduce the amount of backdoor activity simultaneously. And to do that well, day after day, month after month, to get that right is very challenging. And not everybody can keep up with the cost of offering more care that we provide, right? So and inflation increases, right? So year over year, there's a point where some people have to move out because they just can't afford it. They've quote unquote run out of money. And on the nonprofit side, what's great is there's different structures. It's not worth getting into. It's a little bit technical, but like entry fee, it's kind of a contract. And when you put your money in up front, it's a lump sum. It could be several hundreds of thousands of dollars, in some market millions. You pay a monthly fee for care, and then as your needs escalate, you move along the continuum, but you're never going to have to spend beyond your means because you have your sum of money there and you're guaranteed care for the rest of your life. And so that comes like an insurance policy with a certain degree of comfort and security. So I do think the misconception, and that's hard to manage as well, right? Because as people need care, if everybody needs the same level of care at the same time, you may not have the capacity on site. And so that's hard too. So I do think underestimating the complexity, the timeline, and the dynamics has been a challenge, even for the most sophisticated and capable investors. And that's what, frankly, keeps it very interesting for people like me. It's hard work, and when those companies and executive directors at these communities are able to consistently perform at the highest level, it's truly remarkable. And they make it look easy, but it's really hard.
And you've advised governments, investors, and families in this industry. And so you talked a bit about the challenges that the senior housing industry faces with the complexity you were mentioning. I was wondering if you could dive a bit deeper and expand a little bit more on what other challenges that may exist, that each group experiences when thinking about housing for older adults.
Sure. So I'm a very much a resident first person. That's how I always have thought about this business and what intrigues me, right? Is this good enough for my mom, like I referred to earlier? Wasn't, so I set out to make it better. Um, so the hardest part for those that reside with us is coming to terms with, do I need this? Do I want this? Am I going to be happy there? Can I sell my home? What am I going to do with all my things? I'm moving from a few thousand square feet to a few hundred square feet. Am I going to be comfortable? Do I like the people? Am I going to like the food? Am I going to get well cared for? There's a lot of anxiety when you are making a decision on your own terms. And when families are making decisions on behalf of their loved ones, in cases like with dementia, it's a lot of guilt that comes with that. Should I have done more? Could I have done more? Maybe I don't need to do this right now. Is she going to be happy? Is this what she would want if I could ask her? There's a lot of guilt. And so these challenges really are pervasive when you think about the resident and the families. Over time, what's interesting is the data suggests like 70% of the people wish they moved in earlier. Because when you do, you get to enjoy and benefit from all the activities. I think of my grandmother in Florida. I put her there after a hurricane because she lost her power. And then she went home, and years later she went back to move in. And I said to her, "Grandma, here's all these activities you love." She's like, "I'm not well enough to do anything anymore." And it was heartbreaking because here's a woman in her active adult 55 and older community. She was doing all these activities until she was like, not only doing them, she was leading them and organizing them since she was like in her 70s until she was in her 90s. And then ultimately she gets to a place where she could be on the receiving side, and she was too frail and didn't feel well enough to enjoy any of it. And that was heartbreaking to me. I knew better, but it was hard even for me. So that's the part with the residents and the families. The stakeholders on the owner side, right? The hardest part for them is, am I betting on the right operator? Am I betting in the right market? Can they manage the dynamics of often our competitive markets with a lot of supply? Um, and am I betting on the right operator to represent me, my money, my interests best? Right. So they don't know. And having been on the owner side, you could guide and influence what the operator is going to do, but it's ultimately their decision day to day. And so, as an owner that
Owner.
takes an active approach, it can be very tricky. But if you take a passive approach, you lose sight and control of everything that's happening. And then when you have problems, you could have done something about it earlier. But again, you have to be careful because the other part of this equation is the operator. So the operator's greatest concern is, how am I going to manage all of these expenses? Do I have enough staff to take care of these residents? Is my staff sufficiently trained and adequately supported to provide the best care with almost zero margin for error? And we could talk about what happens when that happens, because I've been an expert witness when things don't go as planned. But at the end of the day, that's what they're concerned about. Like, can they manage the resources, both that they've been given by the owner, the margin on the money that they're making, and keep the staffing full so that great care and services are provided across every department, every day, every time. And that's hard, not going to lie. So that's now the regulatory side, which, fortunately I haven't come into that much contact with, but the states want to make sure that these operators are adhering to standards of excellence because, as a good example, there are minimum requirements that the state requires to have a certain number of staff members in a building based on capacity, occupancy, all of that. And so they really care that you're sufficiently staffed. And they also care that you are adhering to the guidelines. So, as an example, a lot of times they'll go like, just one example, they randomly show up, right? Your license is posted that this is a community where this type of service and care is provided. And then they may go in and look at your kitchen and open their refrigerator and realize that there are food items that are not labeled sufficiently. Who put that there? When is it going to expire? When was it put in? There needs to be sufficient labeling and information. So the state is a regulatory body that keeps everybody hopefully adhering to a minimum standard. Because when my grandmother in New York was in a nursing home, the administrator said to me, I said, my grandmother is over medicated. She's been here for a few days and, she's never going to stand up and walk because she's medicated and sedated so much that she can't function at her highest level, not even close. And you're not even giving her a chance. And she said to me, she said, you know what? We only need to review medications. I think she said like every 2 weeks or every month. And I said, no, I understand that. I'm in the business, but that's a minimum, right? That's not what's absolutely appropriate for every resident every time. That's at a minimum. So don't do what the minimum that the state requires to keep your license. Do what's right by the residents. That's where I stand, and that's where I started in this comment. So that's really hard. Um, I hope that answers the question that you are getting at.
No, yeah, of course. And it actually leads quite well into my next question, which is focused on innovation. Because when we're trying to sort of relieve the anxiety of families, of investors trying to not, just keep up with the minimum of what the government or state wants, but trying to, you know, build a service that residents want and residents enjoy having and going through, innovation, I believe, is probably a very, very important factor in this. And so you wrote a white paper, and your white papers and thought leadership have shaped industry conversations globally. And so I want to ask you, what innovations do you think will have the greatest impact on aging populations in the next 5 to 10 years?
I love that. So, yes. So, in 2018, I wrote a paper for the American Senior Housing Association. It's one of our leading industry organizations. And I basically said, as an industry, we could and should do so much better and more. I felt that way. And I alluded to that earlier. I felt that there was a period of time where I saw what was happening with my dad, and I saw my mother's reaction to what I do and what our industry offers. And I just said, it has to be better. Like, how could we not present ourselves in such a favorable way that there are so many misconceptions about what we offer and do? So, in my mind, innovation goes back to the three spheres of what we do. So you can innovate with real estate, you can innovate with healthcare, you can innovate with hospitality. And candidly, I think we need to do every piece of that. And we need to do all of it pretty much immediately and with a sense of urgency, right? Because the population is 80 and older. It's not that the boomers are coming anymore, the boomers are here. So I love giving this talk. I've done it at a number of hospitals and a number of universities on how the baby boom is going to bust senior housing if we don't transform and challenge our thinking and our practices in novel ways. So, one of the areas that I think we have to do better, and this is in the healthcare side, is we have to focus on prevention, right? There is no way as a country people will be able to afford the care that they need now that they're going to live so much longer if we don't, as an industry, orient ourselves on keeping people well, which is candidly what they want. So if you aspire to be well, nobody wants to get sick, and we're an industry that seemingly just serves sick people, there's a complete disconnect. So I think one area of innovation is a focus on prevention. And it goes back to my work with Vitality Society. So in 2020, January, right before the pandemic, it was just very fortuitous timing. The aha moment that I had is like, but wait, what is if we decouple the real estate from the services that we offer and see how people react? We take away the hardest decision, which is, should I move and could I afford it? Right? Let's just put that aside and say, let's provide activities, the type of activities you would find if you lived in these communities, right? Fitness, wellness, things that are enriching and exciting, lectures, talks of all sorts. And not just be on the receiving side of that as a consumer, but also giving them an opportunity to contribute to as a creator to the community and content that we offered. And it went swimmingly well, 5-year pilot. And I self-funded it because I wanted to figure out, would people show up? And they did. On average, those that paid $1 a day was a subscription service. They showed up on average 2 hours a week for our fitness, wellness, and enrichment programming. But our super users, the top 20%, were 2 hours a day. So we built a fanatical fan base. And it was all based on this notion of let's keep you strong. Let's strengthen you. Let's build on your stability. Not so you could stay at home and just do classes with us, but that you could leave your home and do everything else you want to do. And so that emphasis on prevention, I think, is a huge area of innovation. And as an industry, we have to do better and more. And I'm working on areas like that as well, which I'm very excited about. On the real estate side, just as one example, because we can go into this in great detail, we have to figure out different forms of senior housing, right? It can't be one size fits all. Is it intergenerational? Maybe, right? If you think about like my husband's from Brazil. He has his aunts that live near his dad who's not so well. He has cousins, they have kids, right? There's so many people. And so this idea of intergenerational living, and it doesn't even necessarily have to be your own family. I guess our culture, people move away far from their families for jobs and other things, but now the less so, right? Because you could work remote. So the idea and opportunity maybe is they live intergenerationally with other people, and then there's guidelines and guardrails of how you coexist, right? So I think that's another opportunity, but not only. There's also a lot of interest in this cohabitation with people of your generation in a show that you're too young to know, but it was called Golden Girls. And these older women lived together. They were like roughly in their 50s, although it's mind blowing for me to hear that because I'm not 52 and I'm like, God, they seem so old. But at the end of the day, one of them lived with their mom and the rest of them lived and they all became friends and they had great stories and experiences together. And it was a delightful show. And so, this Golden Girl concept of there are many women who are widowed, there are many women who never got married, and there are many women who might have gotten married, lost their spouses, and are not close to their children, geographically or otherwise. So, this idea of changing housing and doing it in different configurations and permutations, I think is super interesting on the real estate side and could potentially drive down the cost when you're cohabitating with different generations and friendships that you're not on your own, right? Um, and then the other area is the hospitality piece of this. There's no question about it. AI is going to change what we do and how we do it. So I just came back from a senior living innovation forum, and there was a lot of discussion about what areas AI can dominate. There are companies that are looking at it from a human resources perspective, like how much more quickly could we screen applicants, onboard them so our positions could be filled so we could provide better hospitality, right? We find better people, they come on faster and they're trained quickly. And that's a huge return on investment for us as an industry where our greatest cost is labor when you're operating these communities. So that part of it is interesting. There's also like the Amazon Echo or Alexa, right? Where you have someone who is your private concierge, always in the room, answering your questions about meals or activities or transportation. Like everything we offer on the hospitality side is much more accessible and understandable when you have someone who's your private guide and your concierge, right? So I do think leaning into technology on the innovation side is vitally important. It will drive down our cost. It would be prohibitively expensive if we staffed a front desk just to answer questions day in and day out. Not every senior is tech literate or wants to be tech entrenched. Some, and increasingly so, they're very comfortable with it if you do it in a simplistic way. But I do think on the hospitality side, it's where I think the technology is extremely interesting, is already available, and could already be introduced and very valuable. So that's where some areas of innovation that are exciting to me.
Focus on the real estate aspect of what you said because it's very interesting to me when you're talking about intergenerational living. And I know, for example, like you mentioned in Brazil, but also in many other cultures around the world, it's very common for people to live in the same household as their parents and as their grandparents and as their aunts and other siblings. And I want to ask you, how do you think senior housing in America is different than senior housing that exists in other parts of the world? And how do you think that we can, use ideas from different countries and how they do senior housing to adopt and improve our version of senior housing?
That's a great question. So I've done quite a bit of consulting projects internationally. And what's interesting is the US tends to be the gold standard, right? We tend to do things, um, let's just say, earlier and sooner than most cultures. So I'm right now speaking with a dear friend of mine who is in the real estate business in Dubai. And what's remarkable is they want to bring senior housing to Dubai. And you start to think, well, wait a second, that's a very young country. Is that going to work? Well, interestingly enough, there are a lot of Europeans and others that are moving to Dubai. And even when they retire, they now can stay in Dubai. And so while you look at the population pyramid, and it is a young population, like any generation, they mature and age, and it's going to take a while, and they want to figure out how to do that. So that's an area where like we become the place that they shop and look. So that's super interesting. On the other side, it's like, what could we learn how other countries care for their elders? And I do think the area of intergenerational housing is super interesting as it relates to that. I'm Jewish, and there are also styles of communities that are called kibbutz. I'm sure maybe you've even studied this, but it's a form of communal living where everybody contributes to different facets of life, whether it be cooking or landscaping or housekeeping. Everybody is contributing. They even have like fields and gardens, and everybody is contributing to society. In that same spirit, I align that with having purpose, right? Because a lot of senior housing, older people are on the receiving side. They don't have to be. There's a community in Pennsylvania, lovely place in Pennsylvania. Community is called Garden Spot Village, and they have a whole hydroponic garden. And these residents manage that garden, and that food is partially served in the cafeteria and then offered to the residents who live there, and they use the food in different ways in their own homes, and they can use it and eat it as well. So this idea of having purpose and contributing to community life, not just being a consumer, but a creator and a contributor, is very valuable. It's aligned with healthier aging, and it helps us as an industry look at ways to reduce our staffing, our costs, whether it be food, which is expensive to get, cheaper to grow. Um, and with the hydroponic option, right, it doesn't have to be necessarily in an environment, most places are not, where you grow food every season, every month. So looking at it in a way where we can give purpose to the residents, we could reduce our costs by doing things in innovative ways. That's interesting to me, and should be interesting to everybody. So taking a page of kibbutz style living is interesting to me as well. So that's another good example. But ultimately, I think, like most developed nations, they're doing it, if not our exact way, very similarly, right? And there's misconceptions and guilt everywhere. When I did a project for a high net worth individual in India, you know, the hardest thing for people to accept was, oh boy, you know, he my son or daughter doesn't treat me well because now they put me in this community. And we flipped that script and we said, wait a second, maybe we can tell the story that they care about you so well. They've been so successful in their career that they could afford to put you in this beautiful place. So flipping the script changed the dynamics entirely. So I thought that was interesting. I was invited by the Philippines government to talk to the developers of the Philippines because what was happening there was super interesting. The Philippines became a lower cost place for people to retire for care and housing than, say, Japan. And it was the same dynamic we were seeing at the same time where Mexico was cheaper than the US. And so you could get more for your money in these countries. And the government said to me, Meredith, we would love to work with you. We think the brain drain of the Philippines that sent so many nurses and doctors to America, we can get them back with better quality senior housing like you have in the US. If we can do that here, we could do that, by the way, much more affordably to build here and much more affordable for anybody to live here. come back. And I thought that was very interesting. I thought that was very, very exciting. But then they said something else. They said, and also now that we know how expensive it is here, we want to bring Americans to us. They had no affiliation with the Philippines. And I said, you know what? I got to draw the line because we as an industry, beyond the affordability factor, struggle to get people to move 10 miles away from their house, no less thousands of miles to another continent where they don't have health care, right? They don't get their health care. They can't validate for yes, Philippines is known to have good health care, but it's still not your doctor. It's not your Medicare. And so I said, I'll come and I'll visit with the developers and I'll talk about senior housing, but I don't want to give you any kind of false sense that Americans are going to retire to the Philippines, even though economically speaking, it'd be very advantageous. It just didn't seem realistic. So I think most countries learn more from us. But like I said, in the Israel example, that's one example of what we can learn from others.
And with so many countries learning from us and learning from you, I want to turn a bit and focus on Vitality Society and your entrepreneurial venture. And so it's been called a lifeline and an oasis by its members. And so, what motivated you to build this virtual community?
Yeah, I just felt that I needed to decouple the real estate from the experience of senior housing because I was trying to figure out who is this next generation customer? What do they really want? And until I found them and met them and served them and supported them over an extended period of time, I truly felt like I wasn't going to ever know. The industry, like I said, always serves like 10, 11%. So we don't know who doesn't come and we don't know who they are and what they want because we never get to see them. They may shop and visit, but then not move in. And so my motivation was to say, I need to be a student of this. I've been doing this for a very long time, right? We talked about that since I've been 15 years old. So I'd already been doing it for decades and I didn't have the answers. The industry doesn't have the answers. So I said, I got to do something differently. It can't really be done in like a focus group, although I did do focus groups to prepare for the platform. But what I learned was why I did it, which was to say, if I take the decision to move or not to move out of the equation, could they and would they show up? And the impact we were having on people's physical well-being, mental well-being was remarkable. And we went from valuable to vital overnight, right? I don't know that we would have existed as long as we did without the pandemic, but the fact that we were there for the pandemic and for people to have a place to go, people to see, something to learn, something to do to stay well. The doctors of our members would say when they would go for appointments, how are you better than you were before the pandemic? Most patients are not. And they're like, well, I'm doing Vitality Society. I do these classes. I met all these people. I mean, it really helped people expand their world at a time where that usually shrinks and help them build their strength at a time where that usually atrophies. And so that we had a huge impact on people. And so my motivation was to have the greatest impact and meet people where they're at, which is at home, and where they want to be, which was at home. And in our case, where they had to stay, at least during the period of the pandemic. So I did that for 5 years, gained as much insight as I could. We were a very small platform because it was a small entity. And for me, it wasn't about serving the most people, it was about learning the most. And then I decided in February of this year that I would accept an opportunity to go work with one of the large nonprofits to basically take the lessons I've learned and do it at a greater scale to have a much more sizable impact on more people. And so for me, it was like going back to school. I learned more for what I needed to know than I did when I got my MBA, right? I went to school doing something that I thought was necessary to really learn something that I needed to learn so that I could prepare for this next chapter of my career. And I couldn't be more excited about it.
And during the time of the pandemic, I mean, you're dealing with so many issues of just the pandemic in general and the issues that came with. How did you approach building trust with older adults online, especially when technology can often be a barrier for people 60 and over?
Oh, that's beautiful. I love that you use that word because I am going to be releasing a white paper with another industry thought leader in January with the American Senior Housing Association again. And we're introducing a new framework. And one of the letters is T for trust. And so you nailed it. Gosh, I should hire you now. Who needs college? You get it more than most. So how do you build trust? So for us, it was interesting. My husband is a software computer science engineer. And when I did my research in 2019, leading up to Vitality Society, I came to the deduction that I'm going to build the community. And what was interesting is you never know how careers are going to work. I didn't mention before I went to business school, I worked for 4 years for Time Warner, and I was responsible for building communities for CNN Sports Illustrated. Fanatical sports fans that came to our community for fantasy football and statistics and scores and other things. This was back in 97 to 99. And what was interesting is I had already done community building. But could it be any different? It ended up being like, forget about all men, young men. It was older women, right? It was the exact opposite. But I didn't have the funding of a Time Warner at the time owned the platform to do this. So I said to my husband, what am I going to do? How am I going to do this? I'm building a community. He's like, well, you're not going to build the community. I'm like, well, yeah, I am. He goes, yes, you will, but go find an off the shelf solution that has a community building tools, find out which one you want. I don't know, there's like so many out there. And then you focus your time and money on making it the experience and the service that you want. And so by virtue of him telling me that and studying all these community platforms and others that exist, I found one called Mighty Networks, and it allowed us to build essentially in a no code kind of way. And why that was important is I was able to build what I wanted within weeks. And what I realized was we were ready. January 6th, we went live. The pandemic happened like 2 months later. So we were ready. And what else was very interesting is as much content as we were going to offer, right? I knew that platform that I didn't have to build and maintain would grow with me, right? Because they already had a lot of tools and they already had a lot of features. And it turned out that as my business school professor said, is like, ultimately you're going to realize that this is not necessarily the best platform. It's going to do like 80% of what you want it to. But the 20% you're going to give up is obviously justifiable because you're not spending millions of dollars. Like people I know build platforms that's millions of dollars to build, millions of dollars to maintain, and then they end up, the business doesn't work and they raised all this money and everything's gone. And so for us, I said to myself, okay, here's the way that this platform is designed. I need to figure out how to make it so simple for our members so that it's not just simple for us to put up content and say, at 11 o'clock on Thursday is yoga or 12 o'clock on Friday is this. Like, that's fine. We can do that very easily with the tools that were provided. But how do I make it easy for those to participate? Because if it wasn't easy, they weren't coming. And so that's where I said, you know what? They need emails. This is the way they're communicating. They don't want to log into our platform and see what's listed. They want emails. So, okay, we're going to push the information to them. And then I started doing it every morning at 9 o'clock. Good morning. Here's what we have today. And then I realized, you know what? That's accessible and desirable. But what if I did it half an hour before every class? And then I said, okay. So I did it at 9 o'clock every morning and a half hour reminder before every class with the link. So they didn't have to do anything. But I had to make some decisions and trade-offs, right? So I didn't make it so that everybody, every time they logged in, remember, a lot of people were coming 2 times a day. They didn't have to put their name and email every single time. And they didn't have to log in. So that was a decision that I made. And so when I wanted to track utilization and how often people are showing up, that was very manual for us. My assistant had to go on and log attendance every class, every time for a week. We did it multiple times. And so again, if people were registering, I would have had that data. But to me, them showing up and making it as easy as possible, as quick as possible, was more valuable than any data who was using it. It was for me. And if need be, we can do it manually. So we had some trade-offs, but we kept it so simple that they couldn't be overwhelmed or confused. And we had a goal for 0 questions and concerns daily. And 95% of the days we did have 0 questions and concerns. And when there was a question or concern, it was like oftentimes it was someone's internet was out, right? It was nothing that we could do about that. But at the end of the day, like I was very proud to keep it simple. So I could focus my time, my resources on delivering the highest quality experience with the best content. And that's what we strove to do. And that's what we did.
Always like sort of wrapping up these podcasts with a couple of looking forward and personal perspective based questions. And so you've been described as a visionary. So I want to ask you, what's the boldest idea you're currently thinking about that most people in the industry aren't ready to talk about or haven't really conceived of yet?
So I'm ramping up to bring new capital into the industry. That's what I'm doing. And I want to do it on the a hybrid between affordable and middle market. So that's very interesting to me. It is very difficult to do. I think people would like to do it, but it's complicated to figure out. And I feel determined to do it. And I know we'll make it happen in the new year.
And finally, for young leaders who are listening, those interested in housing, innovation, or social impact, what lessons from your journey would you want them to walk away with?
Follow your heart. I always felt that I had a big heart and a great mind, and my highest and best use was to do the work that would matter to other people. If it mattered to other people, it would matter to me. And that is where fulfillment comes from. I know many people who have been functionally focused in their careers, like marketing as an example, and they could work in an agency on any different industry and find tremendous fulfillment. For me, I kept it interesting because I stayed in my lane of senior housing, and I always have thought, "Wait a second, how do I do this better? How could we be smarter? How could we serve more people?" And so I show a slide when I do some talks at the college universities and campuses where there's a slide of, like, plane configuration, right? There's one out in front, and then there's, if you think about like a triangle, right? And through that, there's one that's like going a completely different route, right? And in my entire life, I've always been that plane going in a different route. Coming out of Cornell, people were lined up recruiting for banking jobs, consulting jobs. I graduated in 1995. Same thing happened when I graduated Harvard Business School in 2001, going into traditional industries, these professional services type firms that were very sought after, very desirable. Both of those times I paved my own way. And when I got to every job that I had that I never got recruited for, I had to find, I always wanted to be that trailblazer. How can I do it differently and better? And it's one part, oh, so I can get known, I think. I mean, that was probably driving me to a certain extent, but it wasn't. I always wanted to make a difference. And you don't always make a difference doing it the way it's always been done. The best way to make a difference is to do it better. And that has been the theme of my career, and it has served me very well. And I will say you need to train. So, I did go into every company and I did do what was expected of me and I was there to do. But ultimately, I'd be starting to, and sometimes it would happen like the first days. Wait a second. Wait, why are we doing it this way? How could we do it better? How could we serve more people? So I did ask myself the questions early on, but I didn't try to make change happen until I had the credibility to do it right and I had the authority to do it better. So thank you so much for asking all these wonderful questions. How sophisticated you are. You're one of the best interviewers I've had. I salute you and your generation.
Thank you so much. And following your heart and following your passion has definitely been a common theme throughout this interview because my belief has always been if you follow your passion, no one and nothing can truly stop you. And so thank you so much, Meredith, for joining me on my
Oh, I have the
podcast.
goosebumps that you realize that already. I think your generation, my daughter is around your age, as we discussed. And I was just talking to a friend of hers, and her friend wants to go into the fashion industry. And I said, "Oh, this is so interesting." And she looked at me, she's like, "Yeah, but I really need to make the world a better place." And I was like, this is a generation that will be asking that sooner. My generation is, you know, people ultimately have gotten there, but people in your generation are asking that question up front. And thank you for asking us these questions to inspire your generation.
Thank you so much.